The millionaire boss humiliates the maid in front of everyone, laughing and calling her useless, making it clear that she would never be anything more than just a simple employee. What he didn't know was that just hours later, he would be standing before her, desperate when he discovered the truth. The rough, damp cloth glided over the cold marble of the grand ballroom as Ava tried to ignore the aching pain in her back and the exhaustion weighing heavily on her shoulders. She had been there since the early hours of the morning, scrubbing every inch of the luxurious space, ensuring that everything was pristine for the company's grand annual event. The ballroom was enormous, illuminated by crystal chandeliers that reflected the golden light on the elegantly set tables. Expensive floral arrangements filled the air with their fragrance, and waiters began to arrange champagne glasses on silver trays. Ava didn't belong to that world. Her job was to make sure it stayed perfect for the true owners of the night. Her efforts were never acknowledged. She knew that once the party began, no one would notice that it was she who had spent hours ensuring the floor shone, that the chairs were perfectly aligned, and that every surface was free of dust. Her work was essential, but she was invisible. She swallowed hard, taking a deep breath. She couldn't afford to complain. Her mother, Susan, was sick, and the medicines were expensive. The cleaning job's salary wasn't enough for a comfortable life, but it at least ensured that her mother had food and medical care. Ava couldn't fail. Time passed quickly, and soon the guests started arriving. Well-dressed men and women paraded through the ballroom, laughing, talking, showing off shiny jewelry and expensive perfumes. Ava shrank into a corner, keeping to herself. Her job wasn't done yet, and she needed to make sure any dirt was immediately cleaned to ensure nothing would disrupt the night's shine. Then William Harris entered. The company's owner walked in as though he were the center of the universe. His perfectly tailored suit, imposing posture, and arrogant gaze betrayed the coldness that defined him. William was known for his wealth and power, but also for his insensitivity. He didn't see people like Ava. To him, lower-level employees were just interchangeable cogs in the machine of his company. Ava had felt his disdain before. She knew that to him, her existence was insignificant. As he moved through the ballroom, William greeted businessmen and investors with a calculated smile, his tone exuding confidence. He was the host, and everyone seemed to gravitate toward him. Ava turned her gaze away, focusing on her task. She just needed to stay out of trouble and finish her work without drawing attention. But fate had other plans. In an unfortunate move, Ava accidentally bumped into the waiter passing by her. It all happened too quickly. The tray tilted, and before she could react, a champagne glass flew through the air, its golden liquid spilling directly onto William Harris's immaculate suit. A deep silence immediately engulfed the ballroom. Ava felt the air freeze in her throat. William stood still for a moment, staring at the stain on his suit with a look of utter contempt. Then he slowly raised his eyes to Ava, and the coldness in his gaze made her stomach churn. "Do you have any idea what you've just done?" His voice was low, yet venomous. Ava tried to speak, but her mouth went dry. Every guest's eyes were on her. William ran his hand over the wet jacket and let out a dry laugh. "Of course. This could only happen with someone like you." Ava's heart raced. "Sir, I'm so sorry. It was an accident. An accident?" he interrupted, his expression dripping with disdain. "Do you realize how much this suit costs? It's worth more than you make in a year." A murmur rippled through the ballroom. Some guests stifled laughs, while others merely watched the scene with cruel amusement. Ava felt the shame burning her skin. She wished she could disappear, vanish from that place. "You know what your problem is?" William continued, his impatience evident. You'll never be anything more than this, a cleaner, always making mistakes, always messing up, always useless. The word hit like a blow. Useless. The laughter around her grew. Ava clenched her hands, trying to hold back tears. She couldn't lose control here. She couldn't afford to lash out. If she was fired, how would she support her mother? William adjusted his suit, completely ignoring the pain he had just inflicted. "Get this mess out of here," he said, not even glancing at her. The humiliation was complete. Ava quickly turned and left the ballroom, her legs trembling. Once she found an empty corridor, she leaned against the wall and let the tears fall. Her breath came in gasps, and her mind spun in a whirlwind of emotions. No matter how hard she tried to convince herself that she had to endure this for her mother's sake, a deep pain grew in her chest. The morning sun had barely risen on the horizon when Ava left home. Her steps were slow, dragging as if each movement carried the weight of the humiliation from the night before. The chill of the early morning still lingered in the air, and the biting wind made her eyes water, but she knew it wasn't just the wind. William's words still echoed in her mind, repeating cruelly, as though they were etched into her very soul. Useless. You'll never be anything more than a simple cleaner. My suit is worth more than you make in a year. She pulled her thin coat tighter around her body, trying to ease the tightness in her chest. William Harris was a powerful, untouchable man, and she? Just an employee no one noticed, except when she made a mistake. The sound of the guests' laughter still reverberated in her ears, mixing with his look of disdain, the way he had dismissed her as if she were nothing. A quiet anger began to rise within her. A part of her wanted to go back in time, look him in the eye, and tell him that he had no right to treat her that way. But what would that change? She would lose her job. And without her job, how would she pay for her mother's medication? She closed her eyes for a moment, breathing deeply. Her mother was the only reason she put up with everything. Susan had always been a strong woman, one of those people who never complained, even when life took everything from her. She had raised Ava alone, working day and night so her daughter could have the slightest bit of dignity. And now, with her health deteriorating, it was Ava who had to fight for her. She couldn't give up. She adjusted her bag on her shoulder and continued walking, with no particular destination in mind. The first rays of sun illuminated the city, revealing empty streets and shop windows beginning to fill with employees preparing for the workday. Without realizing it, her steps led her to a park. It was peaceful at that hour. Tall trees swayed gently in the wind, and a group of elderly people walked along the cement path. Further down, a couple sat on a wooden bench having coffee. The silence and the cool breeze offered a temporary relief, and Ava allowed herself to sit under a tree. There, alone, her mind began to wander. She thought about her difficult childhood, the way she had learned early on that life wouldn't be easy. She remembered the days when she and her mother barely had enough to eat, the years she spent studying at night after working all day in other people's homes. Nothing had ever been simple for Ava. The world had always seemed cold to those like her, born without privileges. But despite everything, she had never given up. She had always believed that she could find a way to improve her life, that effort would one day bear fruit. So why had William's words hurt her so much? Perhaps because, deep down, she feared he was right. She pressed her lips together, refusing to cry again. She didn't want to feel sorry for herself. Not now. That was when a scream cut through the air. The childlike sound came from the far side of the park, and Ava immediately looked up. Her eyes searched for the source of the scream, and then she saw a little girl running. Her heart stopped. The child, no older than 4 or 5, had slipped from the distracted nanny's arms and was heading toward the busy street. The next sight made Ava's blood freeze. A car was coming at high speed. There was no time to think. Ava jumped to her feet and ran, her feet barely touching the ground. Each beat of her heart echoed in her ears, and the only thing she could see was the child, so small, so fragile. about to take the final step toward the asphalt. She lunged forward, putting all her strength into it. In one final, desperate move, she managed to reach the girl and pull her back, holding her tightly against her chest. Then everything happened at once. The screeching sound of tires on asphalt, the violent impact against her body, the sharp pain that ripped through her leg and spread like fire through her back. The world spun. Her body hit the ground. The child was safe, but Ava felt everything around her fade away. The blue sky disappeared, and all that was left was a dark, silent void. If you've made it this far, I'm sure you're enjoying it, so I'd like to ask you to subscribe to the channel. She blinked several times, trying to clear her blurry vision. The sky above her seemed to spin, and the screams around her sounded distant, muffled, as if they were coming from far away. The warmth of the blood dripping down her skin made her shiver. The crowd quickly formed around her. People pointed, some shouting for help, while others just stood there in shock, watching. But Ava couldn't focus on any face. Her breath was ragged, and every time she tried to move, a sharp pain stopped her. Then she heard a sob. The little girl she had saved was there, crouched beside her, her big, frightened eyes filled with tears. Her small arms clung tightly to Ava's blouse, as if she were afraid to let go. "Please don't die," the child's trembling voice whispered. "Don't die, please." Ava tried to smile to reassure her, but the effort seemed to drain what little energy she had left. Before she could say anything, another figure appeared, running toward them. A well-dressed woman, her face twisted in panic and despair. "Grace, my God, Grace!" She knelt beside the child and pulled her into her arms, frantically checking her over. The little girl turned to the woman and pointed toward Ava. "She saved me, Nanny! She saved me!" The woman, now recognizing her as the child's nanny, turned her gaze toward Ava, her hand flying to her mouth in shock. "My God," she murmured, panic clear on her face. Then Ava heard a name that made her heart stop for a moment. "I need to call Mr. William." William. The reality of the situation hit Ava like a blow. The little girl she had risked her life to save was his daughter. Fate could not be more cruel. Ava tried to process the information, but everything seemed like a confusing whirlwind. Her thoughts were muddled by the pain, and her body was growing heavier by the second. Grace clung to her again, her eyes wide with tears. "Please, don't sleep, miss." The sounds around her began to grow fainter. Ava blinked slowly, fighting against the darkness that threatened to consume her. She heard the nanny speaking urgently into the phone, her voice strained. "Mr. William, there's been an accident. Grace is fine, but a woman, she saved her." The nanny's voice became indistinct. The last thing Ava saw before losing complete consciousness was the worried face of the little girl. Then everything went dark. When she opened her eyes again, everything around her was white. The strong smell of disinfectant and the distant sound of heart monitors made it clear where she was, even before her mind fully awakened. The hospital. She blinked several times, trying to orient herself. The white ceiling and fluorescent lights were harsh on her tired eyes. The sheet over her body felt rough, and there was an uncomfortable weight spreading through her injured leg. It was then that she noticed something that made her stomach churn. Someone was sitting next to her, and it wasn't just anyone. William Harris. He was there, leaning forward, elbows resting on his knees, looking lost. There was no arrogance on his face now. His eyes were lowered, and his expression, unlike anything Ava had seen before, seemed tired, shaken. For a moment, she wondered if she was still dreaming. William Harris wasn't the type of man who cared about people like her. He was cruel, merciless. He had publicly humiliated her the night before, and yet, now, here he was, sitting beside her, as if he had spent hours waiting for her to wake up, as if, somehow, this was affecting him. The silence between them was suffocating. Ava tried to move, but a groan escaped her lips as the pain in her leg intensified. William immediately looked up at the sound, and for the first time she saw something in his eyes that she never imagined she would see. Concern. For a moment he said nothing. He simply watched her, as if trying to find the right words. Ava felt her breathing irregular, her body heavy, and her mind confused. The silence between them was almost unbearable. William Harris, the man who had belittled her existence so many times, was now sitting beside her, looking human. There was no trace of the arrogance she was so accustomed to, no contempt in his eyes like the night before. He seemed different. William ran a hand over his face, taking a deep breath before finally breaking the silence. "I owe you my life." His voice was low, hoarse, laden with a weight that Ava had never heard before. She furrowed her brow, trying to understand. "What?" she murmured, her throat dry. He looked away for a moment, as if struggling with something inside of him. When he looked back at her, his face no longer wore the impassive expression he always had. Now there was something deeper, something approaching vulnerability. "Grace, she is everything to me." His voice trembled slightly when he said his daughter's name. If anything had happened to her. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. The meaning hung in the air, charged with an emotion that Ava hadn't expected to see in him. She blinked a few times, trying to process this absurd scene. William Harris, the man who had humiliated her without remorse, was sitting there beside her bed, admitting that he owed his life to her. "I don't know what to say," she murmured, her mind still struggling to keep up with the events. William lowered his head for a moment, clenching his hands. When he spoke again, the tone of his voice had changed. "I was an idiot." Ava stayed still. He raised his eyes to meet hers, and for the first time, there was no coldness in his gaze. "What I did to you that night." He shook his head as if hating himself for it. "It was unforgivable. I acted like an arrogant man, without understanding the weight of my words." Ava's chest tightened. The face she had to look at just hours ago, filled with disdain, mocking her, was now replaced by someone who seemed remorseful, even regretful. "Yes, it was," she responded, her voice firmer now. William closed his eyes for a moment, as though expecting that answer. "I regret it, Ava. Truly." A lump formed in her throat. Part of her wanted to shout, throw all the pain and anger she had endured at him, to tell him that a simple "I regret it" couldn't erase the pain he had caused her. But something in his expression stopped her. Something that didn't match the cold, distant man she had known. "I don't know if I believe you," she said, the honesty cutting through her voice. William nodded slowly. "I understand. I deserve that." The silence fell between them once more. Ava felt a mix of conflicting emotions. She was face to face with the man who had hurt her the most, and now he was apologizing. He seemed sincere, but she knew she couldn't just forget everything. William leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees. "You need treatment. I'll make sure you have the best doctors and everything you need for your recovery." She frowned. "I don't need your charity." "It's not charity," he immediately retorted. "It's the least I can do." His gaze was firm, determined. Ava wanted to refuse, but she knew that at that moment she needed help. Her mother couldn't afford any more medical expenses. Still, accepting him as her savior after everything was hard to stomach. She looked away, biting her lip. "I never asked you for anything," she murmured. "I know." William sighed, running a hand through his hair. When he stood up, Ava felt a brief moment of relief. But before he left, he did something unexpected. He hesitated for a moment, then spoke, his voice soft and sincere. "I wish I had treated you better from the start." Ava froze. She hadn't expected to hear that. William watched her for another moment, and without saying anything more, he turned and left the room. Ava remained still, her mind spinning with everything that had just happened. Her hands clenched the sheets and her breath was heavy. She didn't know what to think. Days later, after finishing her treatment, she was finally discharged by the doctors. Ava still felt the weight in her leg when she got out of the car in front of her house. The hospital had finally discharged her, but the pain persisted, a constant reminder of what had happened. The bandage covered the area where the impact had hit her, and the doctor had recommended complete rest for a few days. However, resting was a luxury she couldn't afford. As she opened the door, the familiar smell of her small house filled her lungs. The soft aroma of chamomile tea mixed with the scent of soap her mother used to wash the clothes. For a moment, it felt like all the weight of everything she had been through in the past days disappeared. Susan was sitting on the worn-out sofa in the living room, her fingers intertwined, a clear sign of nervousness. As soon as she saw Ava, her eyes filled with tears. "My daughter!" Susan quickly stood up and wrapped Ava in a tight hug, as if she wanted to make sure she was really there, in one piece. Ava closed her eyes, feeling the comfort of her mother's embrace. During her time in the hospital, she had tried to minimize her mother's worry, assuring her that she was fine. But now, in her arms, she felt how much she had needed that moment. "You made me so worried." When they called saying you'd been hit by a car, Susan sobbed, holding her daughter tightly. "Thank God you're alive." "I'm here, Mom, I'm fine." Ava forced a smile, but the exhaustion still weighed heavily on her shoulders. Susan made her sit on the couch, holding her hands as if afraid to let go. Her eyes scanned every detail, as if checking to make sure there were no other invisible wounds. "And that man?" she asked suddenly, furrowing her brow. "The one named William. He came to the hospital, didn't he?" Ava looked away for a moment, taking a deep breath before responding. "Yes, he was there." "And what did he want?" Susan narrowed her eyes, distrust evident on her face. Ava hesitated. How could she explain what had happened? How could she tell her that William Harris, the same man who had humiliated her in front of everyone, was now saying he was sorry, that he had ensured she received the best care and, more than that, had made her an unexpected offer? "He wants me to work in the administrative department of the company." A silence filled the room. Susan blinked, as if she wasn't sure she had heard correctly. "What?" "He said he's going to give me a chance. He wants to make up for what he did, and I don't have to go back to cleaning anymore." Her mother's expression immediately hardened. "And you believe that, Ava? Do you really think a man like him just changed overnight?" Ava bit her lower lip. Part of her wanted to believe, but the other part, the one that knew the cruelty of the world, knew that people didn't change so easily. "I don't know, Mom. But if it means a better salary, if it means we can pay for your medications without so much struggle, then maybe I should give it a try." Susan sighed, placing her hand on her chest. Her eyes showed concern, but also exhaustion. "Just be careful, my daughter. I don't trust men who think they own the world." Ava didn't respond. Deep down, she didn't trust him completely either. The weekend passed quickly. Between the pain, the rest, and her mother's silent worry, Ava barely had time to process what was to come. Then Monday arrived. She looked at herself in the mirror before leaving the house, feeling strange as she saw her own reflection. No more cleaning uniform, no apron or gloves. Now she wore a simple yet elegant blouse and dress pants. Her reflection looked like a different woman. When she arrived at the company, each step felt heavier than usual. The hallways were the same ones she had walked so many times, carrying buckets and cleaning rags. But this time, people's gazes on her were different. She was no longer invisible. Now, they saw her, but not with respect. The looks were filled with curiosity and mostly contempt. Employees whispered, some laughed quietly, others gave her disbelieving expressions. Ava felt every look burning her skin, but she kept her head high. In the hallway leading to the cleaning department, a group of women stopped their conversation when they saw her pass by. Ava recognized them all. She had worked alongside them just a few days ago. Hannah, her closest colleague, was the first to approach. "So it's true," she said, crossing her arms. Ava furrowed her brow. "What? You've become one of the bosses." Hannah's tone was laden with resentment. There was no warmth, no sign of the friendship they once shared, the one where they both endured the difficulties of their work together. "Hannah, it's not like that." Ava tried to explain, but another colleague, Patricia, interrupted her. "Oh, of course. Now that you're on the other side, you won't even remember us, right?" Ava felt her stomach churn. She didn't want them to think that way. It wasn't her fault. Before she could respond, a male voice echoed down the hall. "Ava." She turned and saw William standing there watching her. The whispers grew louder. He approached and gestured with his head. "Come, I want to show you your new office." Ava glanced at Hannah one more time, but her friend only looked away, crossing her arms. Swallowing the urge to justify herself, Ava followed William. Entering the administrative department, she felt completely out of place. The environment was sophisticated, with large glass windows and luxurious furniture. Well-dressed people hurried through the hallways, and the scent of expensive coffee filled the air. It was a world completely different from the one she had always known. Ava felt the weight of the gazes on her with each step she took through the administrative department. The soft carpet under her feet was a stark contrast to the cold marble floors she had spent years scrubbing. Now, she was surrounded by people who didn't see her as a colleague, but as an intruder. The receptionist in the department didn't even try to mask the disdain on her face when Ava approached. Other employees eyed her with curious, malicious looks, whispering among themselves. It was clear that her presence bothered them, and soon it became evident that this discomfort wasn't just from the regular employees. The glass door to the Human Resources office suddenly opened, and Elizabeth Martinez, the manager of the department, stepped out with firm steps, her high heels clicking on the floor. Her sharp eyes immediately found William, who was walking beside Ava, and her expression tightened even more when she saw the young woman beside him. "William, can we talk?" Her voice was controlled, but thick with tension. He nodded and signaled for Ava to follow him. They entered Elizabeth's office, and as soon as the door closed behind them, the woman crossed her arms and let out an impatient sigh. "Tell me this is a mistake." William raised an eyebrow. "What are you talking about?" Elizabeth scoffed, pointing at Ava as if she were a problem that needed to be solved. "Ha! How can you put a cleaner in the administrative department?" Ava's heart raced, but she remained silent. Elizabeth looked at her as if her very presence there was an insult. William maintained his firm posture. "Ava is now part of the administrative team." Elizabeth laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Have you gone mad? What will the other employees think? We've worked hard to select the best professionals, qualified people, and now you just put a woman with no experience, who, until yesterday, was cleaning the halls, into the office." "I don't need your approval to make decisions in my company," William retorted sharply, his voice cutting through the room like ice. Elizabeth narrowed her eyes. "This is an insult to everyone who has worked for years to get here. She has no training, no preparation. And what exactly is stopping her from learning?" William interrupted, his patience clearly thinning. Elizabeth opened her mouth to respond, but he didn't give her the chance. "If anyone here has a problem with this, they can leave," he said, staring directly at her. The silence in the room was deafening. Ava held her breath. Never in her life had anyone defended her like that. She had always been alone, having to prove herself with no support. And now, William Harris, the man who had humiliated her, was standing between her and those who wanted to see her fail. Elizabeth bit her lip, clearly furious, but she didn't argue further. Her gaze shot one last hateful look at Ava before she grabbed some papers from the desk, pretending the issue was over. "Do as you wish," she muttered finally, with a feigned indifference. William didn't respond. He simply walked out of the office, and Ava followed him, still trying to process what had just happened. The following days were as difficult as she had expected. The employees made it clear they did not accept her there. They whispered in the hallways, eyed her from head to toe, threw fake smiles at her as they passed by, and then whispered behind her back. Ava knew they were waiting for her to make a mistake, to prove she didn't belong. At lunchtime, she tried to sit in the common area with the other employees, but the atmosphere fell silent as soon as she arrived. Everyone looked away, pretending not to notice her, but the tension in the air was palpable. After that, she decided to eat alone. But despite everything, she refused to give up. She spent hours studying the documents they gave her to review, learning about the company's administrative processes. She read reports, took notes, asked questions about things she didn't understand, even if the answers came with impatience. And surprisingly, William didn't leave her to struggle on her own. He took time to guide her, explained the procedures, corrected her mistakes with patience, something Ava never imagined he was capable of. "You're learning quickly," he commented one day, after reviewing a report she had organized. Ava looked up, surprised. "Thank you." William rested his arms on the table and watched her for a moment. "I know it's not easy for you," she laughed humorlessly. "That's an understatement." He nodded. "But you'll prove that everyone is wrong." Ava held his gaze for a moment. Something inside her told her he was right. The day was long and exhausting. Ava leaned back in her chair, massaging the back of her neck with her fingers while looking at the papers spread across the desk. Her new routine was challenging, but she refused to back down. Every day there felt like a battle to prove she deserved to be there, that she wasn't just a whim of William Harris. And despite the fatigue, there was a strange feeling inside her, a quiet pride for not having given up. She was lost in these thoughts when William entered the room without warning. "How are you feeling?" he asked, leaning against the door with his arms crossed. Ava straightened her posture and looked at him. She was already used to his presence, but something about him seemed different lately. "I'm fine," she replied, "learning every day." William observed her for a moment before walking closer. "Are you happy here?" Ava hesitated. Happy? That was a difficult word to define. "I like the job," she admitted, "but dealing with the prejudice from the others. It's exhausting." William nodded, as if he had already expected that answer. "I figured it would be like this." "Of course you did," she retorted with a small, sarcastic smile. "After all, just a few days ago, you also saw me the way they see me." He didn't argue. He simply looked at her for a few seconds before finally speaking. "I've always known you were different." The words made something stir within her. Ava frowned, not quite sure how to react. "Different how?" William shrugged. "You don't bow your head. You could have left here humiliated and never come back, but you chose to face all of this. That takes courage." She turned her gaze away, feeling an uncomfortable sensation within her. She didn't want William to compliment her. She didn't want him to see something in her that made her feel special. He couldn't be this man, but lately it was as if he was transforming into someone she didn't recognize. The company building was almost empty when Ava finally left. The night had already fallen, and the city was lit by the streetlights and the glowing neon signs of the stores. She sighed, adjusting her bag on her shoulder. She needed to walk to the bus stop, and the idea of facing the cold night wasn't exactly appealing. "Ava." She turned and saw William standing near the exit, hands in his pockets. "It's late. Want a ride?" Ava hesitated. Getting into a car with William Harris seemed like a terrible idea, but for some reason she didn't refuse. The silence in the car was comfortable, but filled with subtle tension. William drove attentively, his fingers firm on the steering wheel, while Ava looked out the window, watching the city lights blur by. "How long have you worked at the company?" he asked, breaking the silence. 5 years. He nodded as if doing some mental calculation. "And before that?" Ava glanced at him briefly. "Before that, I did whatever it took. Worked in people's homes as a waitress. Anything to pay the bills." William fell silent for a moment. "Did you never think about doing something different?" She let out a humorless laugh. "Do you think I had a choice?" He didn't respond right away. "I think you've always deserved more." The words caught her off guard. Ava turned to look at him, studying his profile. William Harris was saying she deserved more. "It's almost like you really know me," she said, crossing her arms. William smiled faintly, but didn't take his eyes off the road. "Maybe I'm starting to know." Ava felt a shiver run down her spine. There was something too sincere in his voice, something too close, and that made her uncomfortable. The following days felt strangely different. Ava noticed that William looked at her differently. Before, his stares were cold, calculating, always carrying an irritating sense of superiority. But now, there was something else there, something she didn't know how to interpret. He watched her when he thought she didn't notice. His gaze followed her in the hallways, during meetings, even when they were silent in the same room. And Ava began to notice changes in herself. William Harris, the man she had despised for so long, now seemed more human, more accessible. He showed patience when teaching her, cared if she was overloaded, asked about her mother, small gestures, but ones that made something stir inside her. And that scared her. In the past few days, Ava had tried to ignore the unease that was steadily growing inside her. It was subtle, yet constant, like a spark that refused to die even when she tried to extinguish it. The work in the administrative department was still a challenge. She needed to concentrate, prove she deserved to be there, that she wasn't just a whim of William Harris. Yet something kept distracting her, or rather, someone. William looked at her differently. Small gestures, subtle, but they affected her. The way his voice seemed less cutting when he spoke to her, the patience with which he taught her, the looks that sometimes lasted a little too long, and that scared her. It was then, in the middle of this confusion of emotions, that the door to her office suddenly opened. "Ava!" The childlike voice caught her off guard. Before she could react, she felt small arms wrap around her waist. She looked down and saw Grace, William's daughter, hugging her tightly. "Grace, what are you doing here?" The little girl looked up, smiling brightly, her eyes sparkling with joy. "Daddy brought me. I wanted to see you." Ava stood frozen for a moment, unsure of how to react. She glanced toward the door and saw William standing there, leaning against the frame, watching the scene with a serene expression. "She insisted on coming," he explained. Grace hugged her again, ignoring any embarrassment. Ava couldn't help but smile, returning the hug. The bond between them was growing every day, perhaps because of the accident, or perhaps because in some way Ava felt comfortable around the little girl. "I missed you," Grace said, pulling away just enough to look her in the eyes. "You're my friend, you know." Ava's heart tightened. "And I like you a lot too, little one." Grace's smile grew wider, and Ava instinctively looked at William. He was still standing there, watching everything with a different look. Something soft, almost tender. Then he smiled. It wasn't the calculated, rehearsed smile of the ruthless businessman. It wasn't the sarcastic smile of the man who always knew he was superior to others. It was a genuine smile, and that destabilized her more than it should have. She quickly turned her attention back to Grace. "What do you want to do here, little one?" "I want to stay with you." "But I'm working." Can I help? Ava laughed. And what exactly can you do? I know how to paint, and I can count to 100. Wow, that's impressive. Grace giggled, excited, and William cleared his throat softly. I promised her we could have lunch together. If you're busy, we can do it another day. Ava hesitated. She looked at Grace, who was staring at her with expectant eyes, and realized she couldn't say no. I think I can spare some time for lunch. Grace clapped her hands, celebrating. I knew you would say yes. William just watched. Ava tried to ignore the feeling that this lunch would be more complicated than it should have been. The restaurant was elegant and quiet. Grace spoke non-stop, telling stories about school, the drawings she liked, the dogs she wanted to have. Ava listened patiently, laughing every now and then. William also listened, but his eyes often turned toward Ava. He didn't seem distracted or impatient. On the contrary, he was present. Then in the middle of lunch, Grace asked a question that made Ava choke on her drink. Ava, do you like my daddy? William raised his eyebrows. Ava coughed a few times, trying to regain her breath. What? Do you like him? The silence that followed was thick. Ava felt her face heat up. She quickly glanced at William, but he was just watching, waiting for her answer. Ava tried to find the right words. I respect your dad. But do you like him? Grace insisted innocently. Grace, William intervened, trying to suppress a smile. That's not something you ask like that. Why not? Because it's impolite. Grace pouted, disappointed. Ava sighed, trying to compose herself. But that question, asked so innocently, kept echoing in her mind. Did she like William? Of course not. She couldn't. But then, why did her heart race every time he looked at her like that? Why, even after everything he had put her through, did she feel something she couldn't name? Ava's thoughts swirled, the lines between right and wrong blurring as William's presence grew more complicated in her life. The office was silent. Most of the employees had already left, and Ava took advantage of the moment to breathe deeply and organize the documents William had asked her to review. She liked keeping her mind occupied. It was better than dealing with the thoughts that had lately been confusing her. It was then that she heard a soft knock on the door. Come in, she said, without looking up from the papers. The door opened, and when she looked up, she froze. William was standing there. He wasn't wearing his usual perfect suit. His tie was loose, and the sleeves of his shirt were rolled up to his elbows. His face carried a tiredness that Ava couldn't tell if it came from the day's work or from something deeper. She straightened in her chair, feeling strangely restless. Still here? He asked, trying to sound indifferent. I should be asking you that. He walked in and closed the door behind him. You should have already gone home. Ava shrugged. I wanted to finish this. William pulled out a chair and sat down across from her. For a moment, he just looked at her as if choosing the right words. Are you happy here? The question took her by surprise. What? I want to know if you're happy here, if you like the job. Ava hesitated. It was the first time he had asked something like that, and by the look on his face, he seemed like he genuinely wanted to know the answer. She took a deep breath before answering. Yes. William kept his eyes fixed on her, waiting for her to say more. But, he insisted. Ava looked away for a moment, gathering the courage to be honest. It's still hard to deal with the looks of contempt from the others. He nodded slowly, as if he already knew. I imagine it's tough. Do you really imagine? She raised an eyebrow. Because honestly, I don't think someone like you knows what it's like to be looked at, like you don't belong somewhere. William pursed his lips, and for a moment, Ava thought he might retort, but to her surprise, he simply sighed. It's unfair. Is it? She asked, her voice carrying a touch of skepticism. Yes. He leaned forward, looking her in the eye. Because even though you don't believe it, I care about what happens to you. She let out a short laugh, but there was no humor in it. Since when? William studied her for a moment before leaning in just a little closer. I want to know if I can trust you. The question made Ava freeze. She blinked, confused. What? I want to know if I can trust you, he repeated, his tone serious. She furrowed her brow. Why are you asking me that? William hesitated for a moment. Because I'm trying to change. The silence filled the room. Then, before Ava could say anything, William reached out and took her hand. The touch was warm, firm, but also hesitant, like he was afraid she might pull away. He held her hand gently, as if trying to convey something he couldn't say with words. I regret what I did to you, he confessed, his voice softer than usual. Everything. Ava held her breath. That William was so different from the man who had humiliated her at the party. He seemed vulnerable. He seemed sincere. And that was what scared her. Because something inside her was starting to give, and she didn't know if she was ready for that. William's warm touch on Ava's hand lingered even after he slowly withdrew it. His words had left her mind spinning, the confession he had made to her weighing heavily on her heart. I regret everything I did. In the following days, Ava tried to ignore the inner turmoil. She focused on her work, reviewing reports, organizing documents, anything to keep her mind off of what had been said. But no matter how hard she tried, nothing seemed to rid her of the thoughts that now flooded her mind. William Harris confused her. It was as though every gesture he made held a different weight now. A glance that lasted just a second longer than usual, the softer tone of his voice, the silence between them that seemed filled with unspoken words. And yet, part of her still doubted. He was William Harris, a man used to getting everything he wanted, to manipulating situations in his favor. Ava wouldn't be an exception. But then, that night, he appeared. It was after 8. Most of the employees had already left. The office was almost empty, and Ava was finishing up a few notes when she heard soft knocks on her door. Come in, she said, distracted. The door opened, and when she looked up, her breath caught. William stood there. He wasn't in his usual perfect suit. His tie was loose, and the sleeves of his shirt were rolled up to his elbows. His face carried a tired expression that Ava couldn't quite place, as though the weight of the day had taken its toll on him. For a brief moment, she felt her heart race. Her mind was still processing the emotions from the days before. It was as if everything had shifted. He was different, more human, less the impenetrable businessman she had known. She straightened in her chair, trying to hide the unsettling feeling that had taken hold of her. You're still here? He asked, sounding almost surprised. I could ask you the same, she replied, raising an eyebrow. He leaned against the doorframe, his eyes studying her. You should have gone home by now, he said softly, his voice tinged with something Ava couldn't quite identify. I wanted to finish these, she replied, not meeting his gaze. William walked into the room, closing the door behind him. There was a moment of silence between them before he pulled a chair closer and sat down across from her. Are you happy here? His question surprised her. Ava looked up, unsure of what to say. Her thoughts were still tangled in confusion. This was the first time he had asked her something like this. I don't know, she replied honestly after a pause. I like the work, but I'm not sure about everything else. His gaze softened, but there was something determined in his eyes. He leaned forward slightly. You don't have to answer me, but I've been thinking a lot about what I said to you, what I did, and I know I was wrong. Ava felt a tightness in her chest. His words echoed in her mind, stirring something she had been trying to ignore. He had humiliated her, made her feel small and invisible, But now, here he was, sitting in front of her, speaking as though he genuinely regretted everything that had happened. "I know you have every reason to hate me," William continued, his voice quieter now. "But I also know that I can't just walk away from this, from what I did to you." The sincerity in his voice unsettled her. She had never expected this. Never imagined he could feel so remorseful for the way he had treated her. "You've hurt me," Ava said softly, her voice barely a whisper. "I can't forget that." "I don't expect you to," William replied quickly, his expression pained. "But I need you to know that I regret everything. The way I treated you, I never should have spoken to you like that. I never should have made you feel like you were nothing." Her breath hitched, and for a moment she found herself lost in his eyes. The man she had once seen as untouchable, the man who had made her feel like she didn't matter, was now sitting in front of her, vulnerable and filled with regret. "It was my mistake, Ava," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "I don't know how to fix it, but I want to try. I want to prove to you that I'm not the man I was when I humiliated you." Ava's heart raced. A part of her wanted to pull away, to reject him, to remind him of the cruelty he had inflicted. But another part of her, the one that had buried so much pain, was drawn to him. The sincerity in his words, the vulnerability in his eyes. It was so different from what she had expected. "I'm not asking for forgiveness," William added. "I know I don't deserve it. I just want you to know that I'm sorry." The weight of his words hung in the air. Ava remained silent, her mind racing with a whirlwind of emotions. "You don't have to say anything," he said quietly, noticing her hesitation. "I just wanted you to know the truth." He stood up, taking a step back as if giving her space. Ava was still processing everything he had said. Her thoughts were a whirlwind. She had never expected to see this side of William, and yet here he was, open, remorseful, real. "I'll leave you to think about it," he said, his voice softer now. "Just take your time." With that, he turned and left the room, leaving Ava to sit in stunned silence. Her mind couldn't stop racing. The man who had humiliated her, the man who had made her feel small, was now asking for her understanding. But could she truly forgive him? Could she let go of everything he had put her through? She didn't know, but for the first time in a long time, she felt something she hadn't expected: hope. Ava felt the weight of William's words still vibrating inside her. "Give me a chance, just one." He had asked for that without arrogance, without the usual tone of entitlement he used. For the first time, William Harris didn't seem like the man who had humiliated her in the past. He seemed like someone willing to be better. But could she trust that? In the days that followed, Ava found herself observing him more closely. He hadn't pushed for an immediate answer, which in itself was a relief. William seemed to know that any pressure would make her pull away. Instead, he simply continued to be present, without grand gestures or empty promises. And that's why, on a quiet afternoon in the office, Ava finally took a deep breath and made her decision. "I'll give you that chance, William," she said softly. He looked up from his computer, surprised. "What?" She crossed her arms, meeting his gaze. "I said I'll give you that chance, but only because I want to see for myself if you really have changed." For a moment, William didn't say anything. Then a small smile tugged at the corner of his lips. "You won't regret it." Ava wanted to believe him. However, things around them didn't make this transition any easier. In the hallways of the company, the stares on her intensified. The whispers, which had already been constant, now seemed to multiply. Every step she took beside William was followed by expressions of curiosity, contempt, and envy. "Did you see that? She must have something up her sleeve. How else could someone rise so fast? I bet it's just a whim of his. He'll get bored soon." Ava pretended not to hear, but each comment felt like an invisible blow. As much as she had decided to give William a chance, it didn't mean the world around her had changed. In the cleaning department, Hannah, her former friend, barely looked her in the eye. The conversations they once shared had now disappeared. Ava missed the camaraderie they had, but she understood. To the others, she had changed sides, and maybe, in a way, she had. But life, as always, found a way to soften her days. Grace began to show up more and more in her office, always smiling, always full of questions and stories. She would burst into Ava's room with the energy of a whirlwind, hugging her as though they had known each other for a lifetime. "Ava, look at the drawing I made for you." She would pull out a colorful piece of paper from her backpack, proudly displaying her creations. Ava would take the drawing and pretend to analyze it with the utmost seriousness. "This is amazing, Grace. You really have a special talent." The little girl's eyes would light up. "Do you really think so?" "Absolutely." William would watch it all from the doorway, without interrupting. His gaze wasn't just that of a father watching his daughter, but something deeper, something Ava was starting to recognize. He saw her, he truly saw her, and that made her more unsettled than it should have. With the passing days, she noticed that William didn't try to impress her with grand gestures. He didn't force moments or try to speed up something that was still unfolding. Instead, he showed change in the small details. When Ava arrived at the company and he was already there, he always reserved a cup of coffee for her. When he saw she was overloaded, he offered help, even if it was just organizing documents. When the employees whispered, he didn't silence them with his authority, but made sure to treat her with respect in front of everyone. And little by little, Ava began to realize something. He wasn't pretending. William Harris was truly trying to change. That touched her more than any pretty words could. One evening, as she left work late, she found William waiting for her in the parking lot, leaning against his car. "It's late," he said. "Can I give you a ride home?" Ava hesitated for a moment, but for the first time, she didn't refuse. The ride was silent at first. Only the sounds of the city around them and the soft hum of the engine filled the car. "How was your day?" William asked after a while. "Tiring, but productive." He nodded, keeping his eyes on the road. "I've noticed that you've been lighter." Ava furrowed her brow. "What do you mean?" "Before, you always seemed like you were carrying the weight of the world on your shoulders. But now, I see you smile more." She stayed silent. It was true. William parked in front of her house, but didn't turn off the engine right away. He stayed there, looking at her from the passenger seat. "You notice what's happening, don't you, Ava?" Her heart skipped a beat. "What?" "You're letting me in." She looked down at her hands, feeling exposed. "I don't know what to believe anymore," she murmured. William breathed deeply. "Then I just have to keep proving it to you." Ava looked up at him. He was serious, and for the first time, she allowed herself to think that maybe she deserved to be happy. William was right. Ava, little by little, was letting him in. She hadn't noticed it right away. The change happened slowly, almost imperceptibly, like a breeze that gradually becomes a strong wind. At first, it was just a quiet acceptance of his presence. Then she started noticing the details, the way he looked at her when he thought she didn't notice, the way his tone softened when he spoke to her, the little gestures that showed he truly cared. And the scariest part was that she no longer felt the need to pull away. William Harris was becoming a natural part of her days. In the hallways of the company, he made sure to greet her with a quiet smile, without the formality he had once carried. When they had lunch together, something that was becoming more frequent, he listened to everything she said with genuine attention. There was no rush, no power games, just two adults who, in some way, were finding each other along the way. And then there was Grace. The little girl now considered her part of her daily routine. Whenever she could, she would slip out of her father's office to run to Ava, bringing her colorful drawings or asking for help with homework. "Ava, can you help me with this?" "Sure, little one. What is it?" "Math," Grace grimaced. "I hate math. But it's so important." "If it's so important, why does Daddy have a secretary who does everything for him?" Ava laughed, while William, who had been watching the interaction, shook his head, smiling. "Because Daddy has a lot of other things to worry about," he said, picking up Grace. "But he studied hard." "Is that true?" Grace squinted at Ava, suspicious. "Absolutely true," Ava confirmed with a smile. William looked at her then, and Ava felt something different in his gaze. It was a mix of tenderness and admiration, something that made her look away, feeling her heart speed up. There was something growing between them, something that Ava could no longer deny. William was no longer the man who had humiliated her. He was different, more thoughtful, more present. And Ava, for the first time, felt like she had found a place where she was valued. Before, she'd never felt like she belonged anywhere. In the cleaning department, she'd been invisible. In the office, she'd been rejected at first. And now, here, with William and Grace, she felt like she belonged. She felt like maybe she belonged with them, but there was still fear. There was that small, insistent fear inside her that whispered that all of this could fall apart. That William, in the end, was still a powerful man, used to having everything he wanted. And then he surprised her once again. It was on a regular night after work. The office was almost empty, and Ava was finishing organizing her desk. William appeared in the doorway, leaning against the frame with a small smile. "Still here?" "Just finishing a few things." He walked toward her, hands in his pockets, looking thoughtful. "Want to go for a walk?" Ava raised an eyebrow. "Now?" "Now." She hesitated for a moment, but eventually agreed. What she didn't expect was that he would take her to a special place. It wasn't a fancy restaurant or a luxurious hotel. William led her to a hidden garden behind the company building, a green space that few knew about, quiet and lit only by the soft glow of streetlights. "I come here when I need to think," he said, as they walked slowly along the grass. "I didn't know you were the type to need moments to think." "I wasn't, but lately, everything's been different." Ava stopped, looking at him with curiosity. William hesitated for a second, as if gathering courage. Then he took a deep breath. "I want you to be my girlfriend." Her heart stopped. She blinked, unable to process his words. "What?" "I want to be with you, Ava. Not just here at the company, not just as something fleeting. I want something real." She felt her legs weaken. "William, He took a small step forward, closing the distance between them. "I know it may seem too fast. I know you still have doubts, but tell me something." He tilted his head slightly. "What does your heart want?" Ava felt her chest tighten. She wanted to say she didn't know, that there were still doubts, that everything was too confusing. But that would be a lie, because deep down, she knew. She wanted to be with him. She wanted to believe that this was real. So she took a deep breath and, for the first time in a long time, let down her walls completely. "Yes, William." His smile was immediate. "Yes. Yes." William ran a hand through his face, as if processing her response. Then he stepped forward and took her hands. "You won't regret it." Ava closed her eyes for a moment, feeling the soft breeze touch her face. She didn't know what the future would hold, but for the first time in a long time, she decided she wanted to live it. Fate which had once placed them on opposite sides, now brought them together in an unexpected and powerful way.